You ever seen a town that looked too perfect? The kind where every window shines, every street spotless, and every face looks just a little too familiar. I used to think it was peaceful here, quiet, safe. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed the reflections in the windows didn't always match the people walking by. Sometimes, the reflections smiled back even when I didn't. And one night, the lake went still, the whole town stopped moving. Every light, every sound, every heartbeat frozen, except for the ones staring back at me from the water below. That's when I realized the town wasn't sleeping. It was dreaming, and we were all trapped inside its reflection. Elias moved quietly through the submerged streets, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy water that had claimed the city like a silent, suffocating tide. The world around him was a fractured dreamscape, street signs half submerged, windows dark and shattered, their frames dripping with algae and grimy water. His camera hung heavily around his neck, a tether to reality and the only tool he trusted to capture what his eyes sometimes refused to believe. The air was thick with moisture and the faint scent of decay, a lingering reminder of the flood's relentless grip. Elias paused beside a crumbling brick wall, its surface cracked and mottled with moss. A broken mirror hung there, its glass jagged but still reflecting the world in strange, distorted slices. He raised his camera, adjusting the lens carefully to frame the reflection. Through the viewfinder, the flooded street appeared ordinary enough, but when Elias clicked the shutter and reviewed the image, his breath caught in his throat. Beneath the rippling water, the reflection revealed an impossible city. Buildings stood tall and intact, their windows glowing faintly in the dim light. Streets winding away into darkness with a clarity that contradicted the ruin around him. It was as if the water's surface was a veil hiding another, parallel world. Elias felt an electric thrill mingled with an unnameable dread. He captured photo after photo, each revealing more details of this reflected city beneath the flood. At times, he thought he saw movement, a shadow flitting behind a window, a figure standing where no one should be. He shook his head, blaming his own exhaustion, but the images remained stubbornly real. As night fell, the city's silence deepened, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against submerged cars and the distant creaking of a street lamp swaying in the wind. Elias retreated to his apartment, walls plastered with prints of his photographs, each one more unsettling than the last. He studied them obsessively, his eyes tracing the contours of the reflected city, searching for meaning in the ghostly shapes. Outside, the floodwaters glistened under the moonlight, their surface a fragile mirror that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Elias felt the city watching him back, its secrets hidden just beneath the glassy veneer, whispering promises and warnings in the silence. The boundary between his world and the reflection was thinner than he dared imagine, and the question that haunted him was not if, but when it might break. The night grew colder, and Elias's thoughts spiraled into obsession. What was this city beneath the water? Was it a trick of light and shadow, or something far older and darker? He knew only one thing for certain: he had to see more, to chase the reflections until the truth revealed itself, no matter the cost. And as he prepared to plunge deeper into the flood's mirrored world, a flicker in the darkness caught his eye, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of a cracked window pane, watching, waiting. Elias swallowed hard and raised his camera once more, the shutter clicking like a heartbeat in the quiet night, marking the first step into a journey from which there was no return. The afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through the grime-smeared window panes of Elias' cramped apartment, casting a pallid glow over the scattered photographs pinned haphazardly to every available surface. Each image captured the drowned city's haunting visage, shattered facades, submerged streets, and the endless ripple of water that swallowed the world outside. Yet, it was not the usual scenes of ruin that gripped Elias's attention today. It was something subtle, something that defied explanation. He sat hunched over his small desk, a magnifying glass in one hand and a freshly developed photograph in the other. The photograph was of a cracked mirror leaning against a rusted lamppost, its surface reflecting the ghostly outline of a city beneath the floodwaters. But as Elias studied it, his breath caught. One corner of the reflected cityscape seemed to shimmer, the broken window in the image appearing intact, then cracked, then intact again in the span of a few seconds. His eyes darted back and forth, trying to catch the change, but the photograph was static. Yet, in his mind's eye, the reflection shifted. A small dry cough pulled Elias from his trance. He turned to see Mara standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her sharp eyes fixed on him with concern. "Elias," she said softly, stepping inside, "you've been holed up here for days. You need rest. This obsession is eating you alive." He barely acknowledged her, his gaze returning to the photographs pinned around the room. "Look," he whispered, pointing to another image where the water's surface reflected a figure standing in a broken doorway. "Did you see that? The figure wasn't there yesterday." Mara stepped closer, peering at the photo. "It's probably just a trick of the light. Or a shadow. You're pushing yourself too hard." Elias shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "It's more than that. These reflections. They're changing. The city beneath the water isn't just an image, it's alive." Her expression softened, but her voice was firm. "You have to be careful, Elias. This fixation, it's pulling you away from everything real. From me. From yourself." He looked away, the weight of her words sinking into a pit of loneliness deep within him. He had lost so much already: his sister, his grip on normalcy, and yet the reflection offered a strange comfort. A connection to something beyond the empty streets and silent buildings. Days blurred into nights as Elias's world contracted into the dim glow of his apartment. He pored over each photograph, comparing them obsessively. In one image, the reflection of a streetlight flickered erratically. In another, a shadow moved independently of any discernible source. The city in the glass grew increasingly alien, its decay deepening with each new print. Buildings warped and twisted, their silhouettes bending and stretching in impossible ways, and always lurking at the edges, a presence watching, waiting. One evening, as Elias prepared to develop another batch of negatives, the bathroom mirror caught his eye. He paused, staring into the glass as the water droplets trickled down the cracked surface. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow lingering just behind his reflection. He blinked hard, and it was gone. The silence that followed pressed in on him, hollow and oppressive. His heart pounded in his chest as he whispered, "Who's there?" Only his own breath answered back. Mara's visits became less frequent, her patience worn thin by Elias's withdrawal. When she did come, she brought with her books and ancient texts, hoping to anchor him with knowledge and reason. Yet Elias only grew more distant, caught in a spiral where reality and reflection entwined and blurred. One afternoon, Mara confronted him in the cafe where they had once shared lighter days. Rain tapped softly against the window, distorting the world outside into a shifting mosaic of water and light. "Elias," she said, her voice trembling, "this isn't just about photographs anymore. You're losing yourself. The city beneath the reflection isn't just a metaphor. It's a warning." He met her eyes, haunted and hollow. "I have to understand it. If I don't, I'll never find peace." She reached out, but he pulled away, the gulf between them widening. That night, Elias returned to his apartment and stared once more at the photographs. The reflected city was changing, its decay accelerating, its shadows growing darker. And somewhere beneath the glass, something was waking. As the hours slipped by, Elias felt the pull of the reflection strengthen. It whispered promises of secrets revealed, of truths buried beneath the flood. He raised his camera, fingers trembling, and captured one more image, a window in the reflected city, cracked and flickering, through which a pale, gaunt face stared back at him. Elias shivered. The ghosts beneath the glass were no longer content to remain silent, and neither was he. The boundaries between observer and observed thinned with each passing moment. drawing Elias deeper into a world where reflections held dominion, and reality itself seemed to decay. In the quiet darkness of his apartment, surrounded by images of a city drowned but not dead, Elias stood at the precipice of a terrifying revelation, one that would unravel his mind and challenge the very nature of existence. What was real? What was reflection? And what horrors awaited in the space between? The answer lingered just beyond the glass, waiting to be discovered. The library's heavy wooden doors groaned softly as Elias pushed them open, the scent of aging paper and wood polish washing over him like a tide. Mara was already waiting inside, her fingers tracing the spines of countless ancient tomes that lined the towering shelves. The floodlights outside cast brittle shards of pale light through the stained glass windows, painting the dust motes in gold and amber hues. Elias's restless eyes darted across the rows of books, seeking any clue that might explain the unnerving images he'd captured in his photographs. The reflected city was no longer a mere curiosity. It was a riddle etched into the very fabric of the city's history, a whisper beneath the surface of reality. "Here," Mara said, pulling a heavy volume from the shelf with a cautious reverence. The leather-bound book creaked as it opened to reveal yellowed pages filled with handwritten script and faded illustrations. "These are records from the floods a century ago, accounts of people who vanished, of places swallowed whole by water." Elias leaned in, the dim library light catching the sharp angles of his face, casting shadows that deepened the hollows beneath his eyes. His fingers trembled as he turned the page, revealing a map of the city before the waters rose, a map overlaid with cryptic symbols and annotations. "Look here," Mara whispered, pointing to a passage describing the mirrored city, a place said to exist beneath the floodwaters, visible only through reflections in glass and water. The text spoke of trapped souls, reflections acting as prisons and gateways, a liminal space where the boundaries between life and death, reality and illusion, blurred and twisted. Elias's breath caught. The words seemed to resonate with everything he had been seeing, the ghostly shapes in his photographs, the subtle movements that defied explanation. The reflected city was no longer just an image. It was a place alive with secrets, with a dark pulse that beat beneath the surface. "Do you think it's real?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper, not just a legend or a trick of light. Mara's eyes met his, sharp and steady despite the shadows that flickered across the room. "I don't know, but these accounts, they read consistent, spanning decades. People have feared it, believed it, maybe even been consumed by it." The weight of that belief settled heavily between them. Elias felt the familiar stirrings of obsession gnawing at the edges of his mind, the line between research and fixation blurring. The library, once a sanctuary, now felt like a crypt holding untold horrors beneath its quiet walls. As they continued to pore over the texts, Elias noticed the soft drip of water echoing faintly somewhere beyond the shelves, a sound that seemed impossibly out of place. It was as if the library itself remembered the flood, its memory soaked into the very stones. Hours slipped by unnoticed until the fading light outside drew long, somber shadows through the windows. Mara closed the book with a soft thud, her expression grave. "Whatever this inversion is, it's tied to the city's trauma, its losses. It's been waiting, sleeping beneath the surface, and now it's waking." Elias sat back, the weight of her words sinking into him. The reflected city was no mere ghost story. It was an inversion of reality, a mirror of decay and despair. And he was drawn deeper into its depths, a reluctant witness to a nightmare unfolding in the glass. As they left the library, the chill of evening wrapped around them like a shroud. Elias's camera hung heavy at his side, a tether to a world that was slipping farther and farther away. The whispers in the water were growing louder, and he knew that the reflection was no longer content to remain silent. Outside, the city's flooded streets gleamed under the first stars, their surfaces broken only by the faintest flicker of movement beneath an echo of a world that slept beneath its own reflection. Elias Marrow sat hunched over his cluttered desk. the dim light from a flickering lamp casting long shadows on the scattered photographs and negatives strewn across the wooden surface. Each image was a window into the flooded city that had become his obsession, a drowned labyrinth visible only through the fractured lens of reflections. His hands trembled slightly as he held up a freshly developed print, eyes narrowing to catch every detail. The photograph depicted the cracked window of an abandoned shop, the glass mottled with streaks of grime and water stains. But it was the reflection within it that seized his attention. There, in the distorted mirror of the glass, was a shadowy figure, indistinct, but unmistakably humanoid. What startled Elias was not just the presence of this figure, but its apparent movement between two photographs taken only minutes apart. In the first, it stood near the corner of the reflection, a vague silhouette. In the second, it had shifted closer to the center, its outline sharper yet still unsettlingly vague. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of disbelief and a rising tide of fear flooding his senses. Could it be a trick of the light, or perhaps a flaw in the development process? But no, he had carefully controlled every variable. This was something else entirely. The figures in the reflections were moving. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and stared at the image once more. The laws of physics and reality seemed to unravel before him. Reflections were supposed to be passive, silent echoes of the world, not independent actors with volition. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, a living distortion in the glass that defied explanation. Elias felt a chill creep up his spine as he recalled the local legends. Mara had mentioned tales of trapped souls and mirrored doubles lurking beneath the floodwaters. Was he witnessing the first signs of their reawakening? That night, Elias found himself drawn to the cracked mirror hung crookedly on the peeling wall of his apartment. The room was suffused with the low hum of the city's distant waters, the occasional drip from a leaky pipe punctuating the silence. He positioned himself before the mirror, camera in hand, and watched. At first, the reflection was mundane, his pale, gaunt face framed by unruly hair and restless eyes. Then, almost imperceptibly, the image began to warp. The reflected version of himself blinked out of sync, a fraction of a second delayed, and the contours of his face seemed to stretch and twist like ripples on water. Suddenly, a pale, gaunt figure appeared beside him in the reflection, a shadowy double with eyes empty of pupils and features twisted as if seen through warped glass. The figure mimicked Elias's movements, but with subtle differences, a twitch here, a shudder there, a slow, deliberate delay that unsettled him deeply. Elias reached out a trembling hand toward the mirror, fingers brushing the cold surface. The reflected man did the same, their fingers almost touching but separated by the thin, unyielding barrier of glass. A wave of panic surged through Elias's chest. Was this a hallucination born of exhaustion and obsession, or something far more sinister? He lowered his hand slowly, heart hammering, and whispered, "Who are you?" The silence that followed was oppressive, the reflected figure dissolving into the fractured glass. Days bled into one another as Elias traversed the flooded streets at dusk, camera slung over his shoulder, eyes searching the watery surfaces for answers. The city was a ghostly skeleton, buildings half submerged, their decayed facades reflected in the murky waters below. As he raised his camera to capture the scene, he noticed shapes shifting in the ripples, figures swimming against the current. Their forms blurred and indistinct but undeniably alive. The reflections did not obey gravity or logic. They moved with a haunting fluidity, an eerie dance of life beneath the water's glassy veneer. The sound of his camera shutter echoed in the still air, a rhythmic punctuation in the quiet cityscape. Each click was a desperate attempt to freeze the impossible, to document a truth slipping through his fingers like water. But with every photograph, the line between observer and participant blurred. The reflected inhabitants seemed aware of him, their presence pressing in like a weight on his mind. At times, Elias caught glimpses of eyes staring back at him from the depths, hollow and accusing, as if warning him to cease his probing. Back in his apartment, the solitude grew suffocating. Elias found himself talking aloud to the silent room, his voice a fragile tether to sanity. "Are you real?" He asked the shadows, his words swallowed by the thick air. The mirrors and windows surrounding him reflected not only the flooded city, but the fracturing of his own mind. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams where he wandered endless corridors of water and glass, pursued by faceless figures whose movements echoed those in his photographs. Mara's voice, distant and strained, broke through his reverie one evening. "Elias, you have to stop," she urged during a rare visit. "This obsession is consuming you." The reflections, they were not just images, they were warnings. He shook his head, eyes wild. "They re-alive, Mara. They move on their own. I've seen it. I can't turn away now. I have to know what lies beneath the surface." Her expression softened but remained resolute. "Just promise me you'll be careful. The city's history is darker than you realize." As Mara left, Elias felt the walls close in tighter, the reflections in the cracked mirror beckoning with silent promises and threats. The figures in the glass were no longer merely reflections, they were a part of him now, inseparable and terrifying. The boundary between reality and inversion was thinning, and Elias stood at its fragile edge, teetering on the precipice of a revelation that could shatter his mind or the world itself. The night deepened, the city drowned in silence save for the restless stirrings beneath the water's surface. Elias raised his camera once more, focusing on the mirror. The pale figure returned, eyes empty yet watching, waiting. And as the shutter clicked, the reflection smiled a slow, haunting curve that promised the beginning of something irrevocable. The mirror was no longer a barrier. It was a doorway. Elias stood motionless before the cracked mirror in his cramped studio, the dim light casting long shadows across the peeling walls. His eyes, bloodshot and wary, traced the familiar contours of his own reflection, a pale and gaunt figure that seemed almost a stranger to him these days. The camera hung heavy around his neck, a silent witness to his descent into an obsession that had begun with simple curiosity and now bordered on madness. The silence was broken only by the soft tick of a failing clock, its hands hesitating as if caught in time itself. Elias's gaze flicked to the corner of the mirror, where a faint ripple disturbed the glass's surface. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light or a smudge, but then the reflection shifted unnaturally. There, standing behind his reflected self, was another figure, pale, gaunt, and disturbingly still. Its eyes were hollow voids, devoid of pupils, staring unblinkingly at Elias's own mirrored gaze. A chill ran down Elias' spine as the figure's lips curved into a crooked, warped smile, one that did not match any expression on his own face. He blinked, and the figure mimicked the action, but with a subtle delay, as if caught in a fractured time loop. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed the rising tide of dread within him. Who are you?" he whispered, voice cracking in the heavy air. The reflected man did not answer. Instead, it raised a hand, fingers elongated and trembling, and mirrored Elias's hesitant gesture. The reflection was no longer a simple mimicry. It was a distorted parody, a perverse echo warped by some unseen force. Elias stumbled back from the mirror, clutching his camera like a lifeline. He fumbled to raise it, his fingers trembling as he focused the lens on the apparition that lingered just beyond the glass. The shutter clicked, a sharp sound that seemed to shatter the stillness. The figure blinked slowly, as if acknowledging Elias's intrusion, then vanished, dissolving into the fractured shards of the mirror's surface. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and fevered research. Elias found himself drawn back to that studio mirror again and again, eyes scouring every reflection for a glimpse of the haunting figure. The reflected man appeared sporadically, always just at the edge of perception, a shadow lurking beneath the veneer of reality. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled distant warnings, Elias ventured down the narrow hallway that connected his apartment to the dilapidated corridors of the building. The walls, lined with cracked and shattered glass, reflected a fractured world, one where light bent oddly and shadows clung too long. There, in the fragmented reflections, Elias caught sight of the reflected man once more. This time, the figure stepped forward with an eerie grace, its movements both fluid and unnatural. It mimicked Elias's every gesture, but with subtle distortions, a crooked grin here, a delayed blink there, mocking his very existence. "Why are you following me?" Elias demanded, voice barely more than a rasp. The reflected man tilted its head, the hollow eyes seeming to pierce into Elias's soul. In that silent exchange, a terrifying understanding dawned. This was no mere hallucination, but an emissary of the reflected city, a harbinger of the inversion that threatened to consume his reality. Elias fled back to his apartment, breath ragged, heart hammering against his ribs. He locked the door behind him and stared once more into the mirror, the surface rippling like disturbed water. The reflected man's gaze met his own, unblinking and filled with a silent promise of things yet to come. As the night deepened, Elias felt the walls close in, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his mind. The boundary between his world and the reflection thinned, and he knew that his obsession was no longer a mere escape, it was a descent into a darkness from which there might be no return. He whispered to the empty room, "What do you want from me?" Only the mirror responded, its surface shimmering with a cold, otherworldly light. The reflected man had appeared, and with it, the nightmare had truly begun. Elias stood motionless in front of the cracked mirror, propped against the peeling wall of his apartment. The surface, fractured like a shattered lake, reflected not just his gaunt, pale face, but a city behind him, an impossible city. It was the reflected city, but now it was not the quiet, ghostly place he had first glimpsed. The buildings were warped and crumbling, their once proud facades twisted by an unseen rot. Shadows slithered between the ruins, dark and intangible, as if the very air carried a whispered malice. The cold draft that seemed to seep through the glass with secrets he could almost hear, but not quite understand. He raised his camera, the familiar weight a small comfort against the growing unease. But even through the lens, the reflection distorted, bending reality into a grotesque mockery. Elias's fingers trembled as he snapped photo after photo, desperate to capture the shifting decay before it dissolved entirely. Each image seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the buildings bleeding into one another, the shadows stretching longer and darker. Back in the dim light of his apartment, Elias spread the photographs across the stained table, eyes wide and unfocused. The images melded together, a collage of rot and ruin that seemed to breathe beneath the paper. Faces flickered within the shadows, ghostly inhabitants of the reflected city, their shapes blurred and indistinct but undeniably watching. A cold sweat broke across Elias's brow. His thoughts spiraled, tangled with the images before him. Was the decay he saw real, or was it a reflection of his own unraveling mind? A sudden movement caught his eye. The reflected man appeared in the corner of a photo, his distorted form mimicking Elias's pose, but with subtle differences: a tilt of the head, a hollow gaze devoid of pupils. Elias blinked, and the figure seemed to flicker, as if alive yet trapped within the paper. The presence chilled him to the bone. Later, wandering along the flooded streets, Elias paused by the water's edge. The surface shimmered, disturbed by a gentle ripple. He caught sight of the reflected man again, flickering just beneath the water's surface. The figure's pale, gaunt face stared back at him, empty eyes fixed and unblinking. Elias's breath caught. The silent observer was no longer confined to mirrors or photographs, but bled into the world around him, an echo of Elias himself, but warped, alien. The boundary between his reality and the reflected city grew thinner with each passing day. Walls in his apartment seemed to pulse and bend. The air thickened with a damp, decaying smell, like stagnant water and forgotten memories. Elias felt the creeping influence of the inversion in his bones, a slow corrosion of sanity and self. His isolation deepened. Mara's warnings and words faded into distant echoes. One night, Elias collapsed amid the clutter of his darkened room. The city's reflection danced wildly on the cracked glass, the decay mirrored in the twisting walls around him. The weight of the reflected city's rot pressed upon his mind, an overwhelming tide threatening to swallow him whole. As he lay there, disoriented and broken, he realized the inversion was no longer just a distant nightmare. It was inside him, a living echo of the city's slow death. And yet, even as dread consumed him, a melancholic fascination rooted him to the reflection. The decay was not simply destruction. It was transformation, an eerie reminder of loss and the fragile boundary between worlds. Elias knew that understanding this inversion might be his only salvation or his final undoing. He raised his camera once more, hands shaking, eyes glazed, and whispered to the shadows, show me everything." The reflection flickered in response, a silent promise of horrors yet to come. The library was cloaked in a somber silence that only the occasional rustle of turning pages dared to break. The fading daylight filtered through tall windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of ancient bookshelves. Elias sat with his camera bag slung carelessly at his feet, fingers stained with the ink of his scattered notes. His eyes, restless and sunken, scanned the worn spines as if seeking a lifeline amid the creeping fog of his obsession. Mara's presence was a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. She had insisted on meeting him here, in a place where knowledge might pierce the veil of uncertainty that had come to dominate his days. Her sharp eyes, framed by strands of dark hair pulled back with pragmatic efficiency, betrayed the concern she had long harbored but kept carefully contained. With a deliberate motion, Mara reached up and plucked a heavy volume from a high shelf. The book protested with a dry, brittle crack as she opened it, the yellowed pages whispering secrets of a city swallowed by water long ago. Elias leaned in, his breath faltering as faded illustrations mirrored the impossible cityscapes he had captured in his photographs, buildings twisted in watery reflection, streets submerged yet eerily intact. "Look here," Mara said softly, tracing a finger over a passage etched in a script almost lost to time. "This text speaks of a city beneath the surface, a mirror city, if you will. It was said to be a place where the drowned souls linger, trapped between worlds." Elias swallowed hard, the air thick with a tension that settled like a physical weight between them. He reached out, fingertips trembling, touching the fragile paper as if it might dissolve beneath his gaze. "I've seen it," he whispered. "Not just in the pictures. It's real, Mara. It's waking." Her eyes searched his face, the flicker of fear mingling with the stubborn flame of his conviction. "That's what worries me," she said. "This isn't just a haunting memory or a ghost story. The texts warn that such reflections are not merely passive images, but gateways, thresholds guarded by a dark consciousness. They call it the inversion." A chill crept along Elias's spine, the word settling like a poison seed in his mind. "And it's feeding off us, growing stronger." Mara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It waits, patient and hungry. Crossing that boundary, it changes people. It twists reality, warps perception. You're already slipping, Elias. You have to be careful." He looked away, eyes drawn to a photograph pinned to the board, a distorted reflection of a crumbling building submerged beneath murky water. Within the glassy surface, a shadow moved independently, a figure whose eyes seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. Elias's heart hammered, caught between dread and the irresistible pull of fascination. "I can't stop now," he said, voice raw. "If I don't understand it, if I don't capture it, it will consume me from the inside anyway." Mara's jaw tightened. "Then promise me you won't go deeper alone. Promise me you'll let me help." Elias hesitated, the fragile thread of trust stretched taut. "I promise." But beneath the fragile vow, the reflection's pull tugged relentlessly at his soul, whispering promises of revelation and despair. The room grew colder as Mara closed the ancient tome with a soft thud. The sound echoed faintly, a somber punctuation that seemed to seal the knowledge between them. Outside, the city's floodwaters shimmered under a dying light, the boundary between reality and reflection more fragile than ever. Elias's fingers brushed over his camera, the lens fogged with condensation and the weight of unseen worlds. His eyes met Mara's once more, a silent pact forged in the shadow of awakening darkness. The reflection was no longer just an image, it was a living, breathing enigma, and Elias was its unwilling witness. As they left the library, the chill of the evening wrapped around them like a shroud. Mara's warning lingered in Elias's mind, a beacon amidst the encroaching shadows. Yet the reflection's seductive call was impossible to resist. He paused by a shattered window pane, the glass fractured yet still holding a perfect, inverted mosaic of the drowned city. The ghostly silhouettes flickered within, beckoning him forward. Elias raised his camera, the shutter clicking softly, capturing not just an image but a gateway to a nightmare yet to be fully revealed. And somewhere beneath the silent waters, the inversion stirred, awakened by the flicker of a lens and the fragile mind it sought to consume. The cycle had begun anew, and Elias was caught in its relentless tide. The dawn was a pale smear across the sky when Elias found the old pier, its wood slick with moisture and time. The flooded city lay around him, a half-submerged skeleton of streets and shuttered windows. But it was the water itself that held his gaze, the rippling mirror that concealed a world beneath. Leaning against a weather-beaten boat, a figure waited, Jonas Cade, the fisherman whose name had surfaced in whispered conversations and local legends. Jonas was a man carved by the sea and salt, his skin weathered and creased like driftwood, eyes sharp beneath a brimmed hat that shadowed much but never hid the glint of knowing. His hands, rough and calloused from years of hauling nets and braving tides, gestured animatedly as he spoke, each word measured yet heavy with portent. "You want to know about the flood," Jonas began, his voice low and gravelly. "You want the truth beyond the water's calm mask. I've seen things, lad, shadows beneath the glass you were too quick to chase with your camera. There's a reason the city sleeps beneath its own reflection." Elias listened intently, the early morning mist curling around them like a shroud, the distant call of gulls punctuating the silence. "What did you see?" he asked, already knowing that answers here would carry weight and perhaps danger. Jonas's gaze drifted toward the water, where the reflection of the skeletal buildings wavered and fractured with every ripple. It wasn't just the floodwaters that swallowed the streets. There were other things, figures moving beneath the surface, but not like fish or debris. People, or what used to be people. Trapped souls, some say, or maybe twisted reflections caught in the watery grave. They watch, sometimes reach out, but the water keeps them at bay. A shiver traced Elias's spine as he considered the implications. His photographs had already begun to betray hints of these silent watchers, ghostly shapes that flickered at the edge of the frame. Impossible cityscapes layered beneath the surface. Jonas's stories gave form to the nebulous dread that had been growing inside him. And the reflected city, Elias pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonas nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "It's no mere trick of light. It's a place trapped between worlds where time and decay twist into something else entirely. The dead city lives in the glass, waiting, dreaming, hungry. The inversion, they call it, the thing beneath the reflection that waits to break free." Elias's breath hitched. The word inversion was familiar now, echoing from Mara's texts and his own fragmented thoughts. The boundary between his world and the reflection seemed thinner than ever. "Why tell me this?" Elias asked, suspicion mingling with desperate need. Jonas shrugged, the lines on his face deepening. "Because you are not like the others. You see beyond the surface, but be warned, some truths will drown you if you are not careful." The conversation lingered in Elias's mind as the sun climbed higher, fracturing light across the rippling water. He stood alone on the pier after Jonas's boat slipped away, the wind tugging at his coat, and the heavy weight of the fisherman's warnings settling in his chest. He gazed into the reflective depths, searching for answers within the ripples and shadows. The reflected city was no longer just an obsession, it was a looming reality, a dark tide rising beneath the fragile veneer of his world. Elias felt the first stirrings of a resolve hardened by dread and fascination. Whatever awaited beneath the glass, he would face it. But at what cost? The water whispered secrets he was only beginning to understand, and the town slept beneath its own reflection, waiting, watching, and perhaps awakening. As the mist thickened again around the pier, Elias raised his camera, capturing the distorted visage of the city's watery twin and the pale, haunted eyes of the man who had dared to speak its name. The reflection flickered. Something moved just beyond the edge of sight. And the story, like the floodwaters, was far from over. The rain had begun again, soft at first, then gathering strength, drumming a steady rhythm against the cracked window panes of Elias's apartment. Outside, the flooded streets shimmered under the weak glow of street lamps, the water reflecting fractured shards of light that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of reason. Elias stood by the window, his camera hanging loosely around his neck, eyes fixed on the puddles collecting at his feet. The reflections within those shallow pools were no longer stable images but shifting, twitching fragments of another world, a world that whispered and beckoned with a voice that clawed at the edges of his mind. He knelt down, fingers brushing the water's surface, watching as the ripples morphed the reflected buildings into grotesque distortions. A tower bent unnaturally, its spires twisting like the limbs of some ancient creature. The street lamps flickered in the reflection, their light bending and warping into spectral forms that vanished when he blinked. Elias's breath caught. The air around him thickened with a metallic tang, the scent of decay mingling with the cold dampness. His pulse quickened, a cold sweat prickling along his spine. Was this madness, or was the city itself unraveling before him? Night bled into the early hours, but sleep was a stranger. Mara's voice echoed in his mind, a tether to a world he was slipping away from. She had warned him, pleaded with him to resist the pull of the reflected city, to hold fast to reality. Yet the harder he fought, the more the boundaries seemed to dissolve like mist. Inside Mara's apartment, the cluttered shelves lined with dusty tomes and brittle manuscripts were illuminated by the flickering flame of a single candle. Elias paced restlessly as Mara sat opposite, her sharp eyes filled with concern and exhaustion. He tried to explain the strange happenings, the way reflections bent and shifted, how the city beneath the water seemed to pulse with life. But words faltered, twisting into incoherence as the mirror behind him shimmered faintly, catching Mara's gaze. A chill filled the room. The glass rippled like disturbed water, the faint outline of a face emerging pale, distorted, eyes hollow yet piercing. Mara's breath hitched. Elias turned sharply, but the figure was gone, leaving only the cracked mirror and the oppressive silence. Days blurred into nights. Elias's studio became a sanctum of obsession, walls lined with photographs capturing the city's drowned twin. Each image was a fragment of a fractured reality, buildings that bled shadows, streets awash with ghostly figures frozen in impossible poses. He scrutinized every detail, noting subtle changes that no sane observer should perceive. A window once shattered, now whole. A lamppost leaning where it had stood rigid. A shadow stretching beyond its source. His hands trembled as he printed another batch of photographs, the chemical smell mingling with the stale air. The reflected city was no longer just an image, it was a living, breathing enigma that crept into his waking hours and haunted his dreams. The lines between observer and participant blurred, leaving him stranded in a liminal space where certainty was a distant memory. One evening, while wandering the flooded streets beneath a starless sky, Elias paused before a shattered storefront window. The reflection caught his eye, a perfect twin, yet subtly wrong. His own image hesitated, delayed by a heartbeat before mimicking his movements with an eerie, unnatural grace. The reflection's eyes were voids, black pits that seemed to pull at his soul. Elias staggered back, heart hammering, the world tilting on its axis. "Who are you?" he whispered, voice trembling. No answer came, only the slow, deliberate smile of the reflected man as the glass rippled and swallowed the image whole. The city around him seemed to breathe an ancient, decaying beast awakening from a long slumber. Elias's isolation deepened, his mind fracturing under the weight of the dual realities. Mara's warnings faded into distant echoes, drowned beneath the rising tide of reflected shadows and whispered madness. As dawn broke, Elias found himself alone, the boundary between his world and the inversion thinning to a fragile membrane. He was caught between two cities, one real, one reflected, both teetering on the edge of collapse. And the question that haunted him most was no longer whether he could escape the reflected city, but whether he could remember which world was truly his own. The mirror cracked again, a jagged line spreading across its surface like a wound. And from within its depths, a dark presence stirred, watching with eyes that saw beyond the veil. Elias raised his camera, the lens trained on the fractured reflection. With a steadying breath, he pressed the shutter, capturing a moment where reality shattered, and the nightmare began anew. But the images would not be enough to save him. Not this time. The fractured realities whispered promises of oblivion, and Elias was already slipping beneath their surface, lost in the swirl of reflections and decay. And somewhere, in the depths of the mirrored city, the inversion smiled. The office was quiet, the muted hum of the air conditioner the only sound as Elias' marrow settled into the worn leather chair opposite Dreda Helena Voss. The sterile walls, adorned with muted earth tones and framed anatomical illustrations, did little to comfort him. Instead, they seemed to close in, mirroring the claustrophobia that had taken root in his mind. His restless eyes flicked toward the window, where the flooded streets glistened under the pale afternoon light. The water's surface reflecting the distorted silhouettes of drowned buildings, a haunting echo of the city beneath. Voss observed him with professional calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Elias," she began gently, "how have you been since our last session?" He shifted, pulling his coat tighter around his thin frame. It's getting worse," he admitted, voice low and uneven. "The reflections, they're changing. Not just images anymore. It's like they're alive, moving on their own, like they're trying to reach out." She nodded slowly, encouraging him to elaborate. "I've been photographing the city," Elias continued. "But these photos, they don't just capture light. They capture something else. Ghostly shapes beneath the water, impossible cityscapes that shouldn't exist. And the figures, sometimes they move independently of the reflections." Voss's eyes narrowed slightly, concern flickering beneath her composed exterior. "When you say they move independently, can you describe what you mean?" Elias's fingers trembling, he retrieved a small envelope from his coat pocket and handed her a series of photographs. She examined them carefully, images of broken glass, puddles reflecting shattered facades, and within these reflections, faint, distorted shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. One photograph showed a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the edge of a fractured mirror, its form unsettlingly pale and gaunt. "Do you see it?" Elias whispered, voice edged with a haunted fascination. "That figure, it's not me, but it mimics me. It's like a twisted echo. Sometimes it watches me." Voss set the photos down slowly, her expression darkening. "Elias, these experiences you redescribing, have they affected your daily life, your sleep, your interactions with others?" He swallowed hard. "I'm drifting away. Mara's worried. She says I'm losing myself, but I can't stop. The city beneath the reflection, it's waking up. I can feel it pulling me in." The room seemed to grow colder, shadows lengthening across the floor as Elias's voice dropped to a haunted murmur. "It's like the boundary between our world and that inverted city is thinning. I see things moving in the reflections, whispering voices just beneath the surface." Voss leaned forward, empathy softening her tone. "Elias, I want to help you. But I need you to try to distinguish what's real and what might be a manifestation of your mind's distress. He laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. What's real anymore, when the city itself is a reflection of decay, and even the mirrors lie? Their sessions stretched on, each meeting peeling back layers of Elias's subconscious until his narratives became fragmented, punctuated by pauses and fearful glances toward reflective surfaces. Juder Voss noted his growing paranoia, the way his eyes darted away from mirrors in the room, as if expecting the pale, gaunt figure to materialize at any moment. One afternoon, as rain drummed softly against the window pane, Elias sat staring out at the flooded streets. The water's surface shimmered, and for a fleeting moment, the drowned city's spectral outline flickered in the glass behind him. He shivered, the melancholic dread settling over him like a dense fog. "I don't know if I'm losing myself," he confessed quietly, "or if the reflection's pulling me into something darker." Voss reached out, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, you're not alone. We'll face it together." But even as she spoke, an unspoken tension lingered in the room, the fragile boundary between their worlds, and between Elias's tenuous grasp on reality and the encroaching nightmare beneath the glass, was fraying fast. The reflected city was waking, and with it, the shadows within Elias's mind grew ever darker, threatening to consume him whole. Outside, the waters rippled under the gathering dusk, whispering secrets of decay and inversion that only Elias seemed destined to hear. As he left the office that day, his footsteps echoed hollowly down the corridor, the weight of his obsession pressing heavier with each passing moment. The psychiatrist's concern was real, but perhaps too late. The reflected city was no longer just a vision, it was a living nightmare, and Elias was already ensnared within its depths. And in the quiet solitude of his apartment, mirrors flickered faintly, as if breathing with a life of their own, waiting for the next moment when the boundary would break, and the reflection would claim its watcher. The fragile line between sanity and madness had never seemed so perilous, nor the shadows beneath the glass so alive. Elias's journey was just beginning, and the haunting reflection awaited with patient inevitability. The air in Elias's apartment was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Outside, the flooded city lay still beneath a sullen sky, water lapping quietly against submerged street signs and the skeletal frames of buildings half swallowed by the tide. Elias stood before the cracked mirror, propped against the peeling wallpaper, his breath shallow, eyes fixed on the undulating image that shimmered within the glass. It began with the faintest ripple, a subtle distortion that flickered along the surface of the reflection independent from the stillness around him. At first, Elias thought it was a trick of the light, a wavering caused by the imperfect glass or a draught sneaking through the cracked window. But as he watched, the ripple grew more pronounced, flowing like a slow pulse that spread through the images of sunken streets and drowned storefronts. He reached out, fingers trembling, but the glass remained cold and unyielding. The reflection continued to stir as if alive, the water in the mirrored city responding to some unseen force beneath the surface. Elias's pulse quickened, a shiver tracing down his spine. This was no mere image. The city beneath the flood was waking. Days earlier, his photographs had begun to hint at this phenomenon, ghostly shapes flickering just beyond the edges of the frames. Impossible configurations of buildings that twisted and leaned in ways that defied reality. But now, the evidence was undeniable. The reflected city was not a static echo trapped in glass. It was a living, breathing place, its inhabitants stirring from a long slumber. That evening, Elias found himself drawn to a shallow puddle beneath a cracked street lamp. The murky water mirrored the dim light, but as he leaned closer, a faint whisper brushed against his ears. His name, soft, fragmented, carried on the breath of the night. He froze, heart pounding, scanning the empty street. No one was there. The voice came from the water itself, from the reflection that shimmered on its surface. Elias. He recoiled, swallowing his rising panic. Was it madness creeping in? The isolation gnawing away at his sanity? Or was it a message, a call from the reflected city? The next afternoon, Elias wandered the flooded market district, camera slung over his shoulder. The light was dull, filtered through grey clouds that hung low. He paused before a shattered storefront window, watching the distorted reflection of the street behind him. Within the glass, a shadow shifted, a figure that should not have been there. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its form flickering between clarity and distortion. The figure did not mimic Elias's movements. It acted independently, its gaze locked onto him through the glass. A chill ran through Elias's spine. This was the reflected man, the pale, gaunt spectre he had glimpsed before, more than a reflection, less than a ghost. Back in his apartment, Elias reviewed the latest batch of photographs. The images flickered on his screen, each frame capturing the eerie movements within the reflected city. Then, one image froze his breath there. In the center of the frame, the reflected man's eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural light pulsing beneath the surface. The line between reality and reflection blurred further with each passing moment. Elias felt the weight of something ancient and dark pressing against the fragile boundary. The inversion was stirring, feeding on the decay and entropy that seeped through the drowned city's veins. He whispered to himself in the darkness, their rewaking. Outside, the city waited silent, watching, ready to cross the threshold. And Elias knew the nightmare was only beginning. The room was a maze of glass and silver, an intricate labyrinth of reflections that fractured and multiplied the flooded cityscape beyond the windows. Elias' marrow moved carefully among the mirrors he had mounted on every available surface, each pane capturing a piece of the drowned streets. The submerged buildings that loomed like ghosts beneath the water's glassy skin. His breath came shallow, eyes darting between the reflections and his own pale, gaunt face staring back at him from every angle. The camera hung forgotten around his neck as a silent witness to his increasing obsession. He had spent days assembling this impromptu studio in the cramped apartment he scarcely left anymore. The mirrors ranged from tiny handheld shards to large, cracked panels salvaged from abandoned storefronts. Each reflected a sliver of the city's submerged skeleton, but with every glance, Elias noticed something else, something subtle and disquieting. Shapes moved where no movement should be. Shadows shifted independently of their sources. The reflected city was not static, it breathed. With trembling hands, Elias reached out to touch one of the larger mirrors. The glass was unnaturally cold, far colder than it should have been in the stifling summer heat. His fingers pressed against the surface, and for a moment, he felt a strange pull, as if the mirror's surface were less a boundary and more a membrane. Stretched thin and quivering beneath his touch. He recoiled slightly, heart hammering. The reflected city seemed to ripple beneath the glass, the drowned streets warping and twisting like the surface of a disturbed pond. Elias, a voice called softly from the doorway. Mara stood framed by the dim light, her sharp eyes scanning the chaotic arrangement of mirrors. "You can't keep doing this, it's not healthy." He turned to her, the restless eyes meeting her concerned gaze. "I'm close, Mara," he whispered. "I can feel it. The reflection, it's not just a trick of light. There's something there, something alive." She stepped forward cautiously, her practical demeanor a stark contrast to the surreal scene around them. "You're losing yourself in this. You need to step back before it consumes you." Elias shook his head, a bitter smile flickering on his lips. "I have to understand. If I don't, it will only get worse. The boundary is thinning. I can see it every day." Mara sighed, stepping closer but careful not to touch the mirrors. "Then let me help you, Elias. Let me find the answers with you, but don't cross the line alone." Before he could reply, a sudden chill swept through the room. One of the cracked mirrors on the far wall shimmered unnaturally, and Elias's gaze snapped to it. There, within the fractured glass, a figure appeared, pale, gaunt, and disturbingly familiar, the reflected man. His eyes, devoid of pupils, locked onto Elias's with an unsettling intensity. The figure mimicked Elias's movements with eerie precision, but with subtle distortions, a delayed blink, a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elias felt a shiver crawl up his spine as the reflection beckoned him forward with a slow, deliberate gesture. His breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to shrink, the mirrors closing in like the walls of a tomb. "Don't," Mara warned, her voice trembling. "Don't let it drag you in." But Elias was already moving toward the mirror, drawn by a terrifying fascination. His hand reached out once more, fingers grazing the cool, slick surface. The pull was stronger now, almost tangible, as if the glass was a veil between two worlds, and he was on the cusp of crossing over. Suddenly, the reflections around him fractured, the room spinning into a kaleidoscope of images, the drowned city beneath the water, the distorted faces of its inhabitants, the dark, shifting presence of the inversion lurking just beyond perception. Elias's heart pounded as he realized the peril he was courting. The threshold was dangerously thin, and each experiment brought him closer to losing his grip on reality. Yet the pull was irresistible. The reflected city whispered promises of hidden truths and answers to the questions that gnawed at his soul. As the night deepened, Mara reached out to steady him, her hand trembling. "We have to be careful," she murmured. "This is more than obsession now. It's a crossing." Elias nodded, eyes never leaving the mirror where the reflected man waited, a silent sentinel at the border of two worlds. The boundary was no longer a barrier. It was a threshold, and Elias was poised to step through. Outside, the city lay drowned and silent, but in the mirrors a hidden world stirred, a world of decay and inversion, waiting for its watcher to cross the line. And Elias was ready to follow. The night held its breath as the fragile boundary between realities thinned, and the reflection's pull became an irresistible force. Elias's experiments had brought him to the edge of the abyss, and the dark waters beneath the glass waited to claim him. Would he find the truths he sought, or would he become another lost shadow in the drowned city's endless reflection? The answer waited just beyond the mirror's surface, where reality inverted and decay whispered secrets only the brave or the damned could hear. And with a final, hesitant step, Elias reached out once more, ready to cross the threshold. The twilight hour settled over the flooded city like a shroud, the dying light filtering weakly through thick, ashen clouds that clung low to the horizon. Elias Marrow stood motionless before the cracked mirror mounted crookedly on the faded wall of his apartment. The mirror's surface, marred by age and neglect, held an unsettling stillness that belied the turmoil simmering beneath. It was here, in this liminal space between day and night, that the boundary between his world and the inverted reflection felt thinnest, most vulnerable. His eyes, restless and hollowed by sleepless nights, locked onto the glass. At first, all was as expected. A pale, gaunt figure stared back, framed by the peeling wallpaper and the cluttered detritus of his solitary existence. But then, subtle ripples began to crawl across the mirror's surface, like faint waves on a lake disturbed by an unseen current. The reflected city began to shimmer and distort, revealing fleeting glimpses of drowned streets, fractured buildings half submerged beneath an endless, dark water. A figure materialized within the reflection, tall, pale, and impossibly gaunt, with eyes empty of pupils that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The reflected man, he moved with a slow, unnatural grace, mimicking Elias's every gesture, but with a sinister delay as if caught in a twisted echo chamber. The sight sent a shiver coursing down Elias's spine, an icy thrill of dread mingled with a morbid curiosity that he could no longer deny. "Who are you?" Elias whispered, his voice barely carrying over the thick silence. The reflected man said nothing. Instead, he raised a hand, fingers elongated and warped, and beckoned with a slow, deliberate motion. The mirror's surface rippled again, this time more violently, as if the glass had liquefied beneath Elias's gaze. A cold breeze swept through the room, raising goosebumps on his skin and carrying with it the faintest scent of brine and decay. Compelled by a force he neither understood nor resisted, Elias reached out. His fingertips brushed the mirror's surface, which felt unnervingly like cold, flowing water. The reflection twisted and morphed beneath his touch, his own image distorting into a grotesque version of himself, eyes sunken deeper. Skin mottled and cracked like ancient porcelain, lips pulled taut over sharpened teeth. A sudden vertigo seized him, and the walls around him seemed to stretch and warp. The familiar confines of his apartment dissolved, replaced by a choking fog that tasted of salt and rot. When his eyes cleared, he found himself standing ankle-deep in murky floodwaters that lapped against shattered stone facades. Their once proud carvings eroded and dripping with stagnant slime. Above, a bruised sky churned with turbulent clouds, casting the drowned city in a pallid, sickly light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint, rhythmic lapping of water and distant, unintelligible echoes that seemed to whisper secrets just beyond comprehension. The reflected man stood nearby, his hollow gaze fixed upon a shadowy spire that rose like a jagged tooth from the flooded ruins, a monolith of decay and forgotten memories. He gestured toward it silently, a summons impossible to ignore. Elias's heart pounded with a mixture of terror and awe. The pull was undeniable, an ancient, predatory force beckoning him deeper into this inverted nightmare where time and reality twisted upon themselves. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that each step forward risked losing himself, more completely his identity, his sanity, perhaps even his soul. Yet the artist in him, the desperate chronicler of hidden truths, could not resist. The mirror's pull was a siren song, and Elias' marrow was already caught in its haunting melody. He took a tentative step toward the spire, water swirling around his boots, and the whispered voices grew louder, half-formed words in a language long dead, promising revelation and oblivion in equal measure. The reflected city was awakening, and with it, Elias was becoming irrevocably entwined in its dark, decaying heart. The night deepened, and the boundary between worlds thinned still further. Somewhere just beyond the edge of perception, the inversion stirred, aware of its new pawn drawn into the depths. Elias's journey into darkness was only beginning, and the mirror's pull would not be denied. As the first stars blinked uncertainly in the bruised sky, the line between reflection and reality shattered, and the nightmare beneath the surface reached out to claim him. The heavy silence of the library's archive room was punctuated only by the soft rustling of brittle pages as Mara Velis sat hunched over a rickety wooden table. The flickering overhead light cast a wavering glow that danced across her sharp eyes, and the ancient manuscripts spread before her like a fragmented map of the city's submerged past. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of discovery. The texts, long forgotten and forgotten for a reason, whispered secrets both terrible and profound, an ancient consciousness born from the city's collective trauma, decay, and loss, an entity that had slumbered beneath the floodwaters for centuries. Mara's breath hitched as she traced her eyes over a particularly dense passage, the script curling and twisting in a way that seemed almost alive, as if the ink itself resisted being read. It spoke of the inversion, a name she had heard murmured from the lips of terrified elders and dismissed as myth by most. But here, in these fragile leaves, the inversion was more than legend, it was an embodiment of entropy. A dark force birthed from the city's drowned history and the pain buried beneath its reflections. Her mind reeled with the implications. The city Elias was so obsessed with, the one visible only in reflections, was not merely a ghostly echo, but a battleground of ancient forces. The boundaries that separated their world from that inversion were thinning, fracturing under the weight of time and Elias's relentless probing. Determined to share her findings, Mara gathered the fragile texts carefully, knowing Elias would not understand unless shown the evidence firsthand. She moved swiftly through the rain-slicked streets, the city around her a maze of flooded alleys and distorted reflections shimmering in puddles and broken glass. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself was charged with a growing tension. Arriving at Elias's apartment, Mara found him hunched over his cluttered desk, surrounded by photographs that bore the faint shimmer of something unnatural. His gaunt face was pale, eyes glassy and restless, fingers stained with the ink and chemicals of his craft. For a moment, he barely registered her presence, lost in the shifting images of the reflected city. "Elias," Mara said softly, her voice steady but urgent. "I found something. Things about the inversion. It's not just a legend, it's real, and the boundary it's breaking." She unfolded the manuscripts, spreading them across his desk. He blinked, focusing on the yellowed pages as if seeing them anew. "Show me," he whispered, a tremor in his voice betraying his fragile grip on reality. Together they pored over the texts, the room shrinking around them as the words wove a tapestry of despair and inevitability. The inversion was born from the city's darkest moments, the floods that had drowned neighborhoods, the forgotten tragedies of those lost beneath the waters, and the collective sorrow that seeped into the fabric of the place itself. It was an ancient consciousness, a parasite feeding on decay and inversion, waiting for the moment to rise again. Mara's voice broke the silence. "We need to prepare, Elias. Whatever you've been chasing, it's more dangerous than we thought." He nodded slowly, the obsession in his eyes now tinged with a new dread. "I can't stop now, not when the reflection is waking." The candle on the windowsill flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the scattered notes and photographs. Outside, the city lay drowned beneath a waning moon, its flooded streets shimmering with unnatural light. The reflections twisted and shimmered, hinting at the fragile veil between their reality and the inversion. Mara clasped Elias's shoulder gently. "We were standing on the edge, Elias. The city's past is bleeding into the present. We have to face it together." He met her gaze, a flicker of resolve battling the encroaching madness. Together, he agreed, though the word felt fragile, as if spoken into a storm. As the night deepened, the two friends sat amidst the relics of a buried history, their minds racing against the impending collapse. The fragments of the past had been unearthed, and with them, the certainty that the reflections awakening heralded a reckoning not just for the city, but for their very souls. The boundary was cracking, and there was no turning back. Every moment in that cramped apartment seemed charged with a weight neither could fully comprehend. Mara's discovery had shifted the axis of Elias's obsession from mere curiosity to a desperate need for understanding and survival. The ancient manuscript spoke of rituals and warnings, of a cycle of decay and rebirth that mirrored the city's own fate. The inversion was not a singular force, but a culmination of the city's trauma, an entity that thrived on dissolution and inversion of reality. Elias sat back, rubbing his temples. If it's true, if the reflection is waking because of this, then everything I've seen, the figures moving, the distortions, they signs that the boundary is failing, Mara replied gravely. And if it collapses completely, the city we know and the one beneath the reflection will merge. The consequences are unimaginable. The room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. Outside, a distant rumble echoed thunder, or perhaps something more sinister, rolling over the flooded cityscape. Mara glanced toward the window, shadows rippling across the glass, like the slow breathing of the reflected city. "We need to document this," Mara said, "to prepare. If the inversion's influence is growing, the only way to fight it is to understand it fully." Elias nodded, already reaching for his camera. "Then let's begin." As they worked into the early hours, the city beyond their walls seemed to hold its breath. The fragmented past was no longer hidden beneath layers of water, and time it was rising, reflected and inverted, threatening to swallow them whole. And in that fragile moment between fear and determination, Mara and Elias braced themselves for the storm to come. The boundary was breaking, and nothing would ever be the same. The sky darkened with a slow, grinding inevitability, as if the heavens themselves were gathering their breath before a long, dreadful exhalation. Elias stood on the edge of the old pier, the wooden planks slick beneath his boots, his camera hanging heavy against his chest. The city around him, submerged and silent, seemed to hold its breath, too waiting, watching. Above, clouds twisted like dark smoke, thick and low, blotting out the sun's pale light. A sudden gust swept the water's surface, sending ripples that danced like restless spirits over the glassy flood. Elias lifted his camera, the lens trained on the reflections that shimmered and warped with each wave. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold but from the weight of the storm, not yet fully unleashed, and the strange, burgeoning force he sensed beneath the surface. The air smelled of damp earth and ozone, a scent that teased the edges of memory and dread. It was the smell of something old, something forgotten but not gone. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, tapping a rhythm on the water and the cracked concrete, Elias felt the familiar thrumming of unease tighten in his chest. Inside the library, Mara Velis's fingers flipped urgently through the brittle pages of a tome so ancient even the dust seemed to hold its breath. Her sharp eyes scanned cryptic symbols and faded script, the only illumination a flickering lamp casting long shadows on the worn wood. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and scattering loose papers like frightened birds. Mara's heart pounded in time with the storm's rising fury. The text spoke of awakening, of boundaries breaking, of the city beneath the reflection stirring after long slumber. "You don't understand, Mara," Elias whispered when she confronted him that morning, voice low and raw with desperation. "They re-waking up. The city. It's alive beneath the glass. I can see them moving now, figures, shadows. They no longer just reflections. They real." Mara's eyes softened, but her grip on reality was firm. "Elias, this obsession is pulling you under. I'm worried you'll disappear into that world and never come back." But Elias heard only the rising storm, the siren call of something vast and unknowable just beyond the veil. Back in his apartment, the tempest outside turned fierce, rain lashing against cracked windows and wind rattling the old frames. Elias stared into his cracked mirror, the glass rippling as if liquid. The reflected man stood there behind him, pale and gaunt, eyes empty voids that swallowed light. Elias froze, breath shallow. The figure mimicked his every movement but warped, grotesque and echo twisted by decay. The boundary thinned with each passing moment, the reflected city's chaos spilling into his world. Outside, the flooded streets writhed under the storm's assault. The water pushed against ruined facades, waves slapping like hands grasping for release. Beneath the surface, shadows stirred, restless, desperate. Figures moved with frantic urgency, their forms flickering like dying candle flames in the dark. Elias's mind spiraled, a tempest as fierce as the one outside. His photographs, once mere images, now felt like grim talismans holding back an overwhelming entropy. The line between observer and participant blurred, his reality fracturing like the city itself. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the drowned streets in stark, electric clarity. In that flash, Elias saw the reflected city's decay, a twisted inversion of his own world, walls crumbling into water, streets unraveling into shadow. And in the distance, the dark consciousness the inversion awakened, feeding on the storm's fury and the growing madness of the man who dared to watch. His obsession, once a quiet H, had become a roaring tempest. And as the storm approached its terrible crescendo, Elias knew the fragile boundary between worlds would soon shatter, plunging both realities into chaos. Yet even as dread coiled tight in his gut, a strange fascination held him fast, an irresistible pull toward the unknown. The storm was not just a harbinger of ruin. It was a call, a summons to cross the threshold, and Elias would answer. The city waited beneath its own reflection, asleep no longer. The storm was coming. The storm had been gathering strength all afternoon, a brooding presence that darkened the sky and churned the waters, swallowing the city streets. Elias Marrow stood alone in his cramped apartment, the faint glow of his camera's screen casting ghostly light over the cracked mirror propped against the wall. The floodwaters crept steadily higher outside, seeping through broken windows and pooling at the threshold, but it was the mirror that held Elias' full attention now. He had been drawn to it all day, an inexplicable compulsion pulling at him like a tide beneath the surface. His fingers trembled as they brushed the cold glass, the reflection shimmering oddly, as if the surface itself were liquid. Thunder rumbled, shaking the walls, and a sudden gust rattled the window panes. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the mirror rippled like disturbed water. A cold, insistent force reached out from the depths behind the glass, drawing Elias forward. He tried to resist, gripping the edges of the frame, but it was futile. His feet slipped on the slick wooden floor, and with a final, shuddering breath, he was pulled through the mirror's surface. The world inverted. Where once was his apartment now stretched a fractured cityscape, soaked and drowned beneath a heavy sky bruised with purple and ash. Buildings, twisted and decayed, leaned precariously over flooded streets where murky water lapped at crumbling stone. The air was thick with the scent of rot and salt, and the faint sound of dripping echoed endlessly. Elias staggered forward, his heart pounding, eyes wide as he took in the grotesque reflection of the city he thought he knew. The sky above was a bruised canvas, streaked with flashes of lightning that illuminated walls mottled with dark stains and cracked glass. Ghostly faces shimmered in puddles and broken windows, silent watchers from beneath the surface. The silence pressed heavily, broken only by the distant creak of waterlogged wood and the faint whisper of voices just beyond understanding. Elias's skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes tracking his every movement. A sudden shift in the air brought movement. From the shadows emerged the reflected man, his form pale and gaunt, features warped like a cracked mirror image of Elias himself. His eyes, hollow and devoid of pupils, locked onto Elias's with unnerving intensity. Without a word, he gestured toward the heart of the decayed city, a dark mass beneath the surface that pulsed with malevolent life. Elias swallowed hard, every instinct urging him to flee, but curiosity, that dangerous ember, held him rooted. The reflected man's presence was both a guide and a warning, a living symbol of the inversion that threatened to consume him. As Elias turned to move away, the city responded. Streets twisted and warped, buildings bending in impossible angles, as if the very fabric of this world were unraveling. Shadows stretched and writhed, coalescing into grotesque shapes that lurched toward him from the dark corners. The oppressive atmosphere bore down on his mind, a suffocating weight that gnawed at his sense of self and reality. Panic surged, but Elias forced himself to steady his breath. He had crossed a boundary few dared to acknowledge between reality and reflection, sanity and madness. Each step forward was a battle against the creeping chaos, a desperate attempt to hold on to his identity amid the decay. Lightning cracked overhead, briefly illuminating the twisted skyline as the floodwaters sloshed against ruined facades. Elias knew that the inversion, the dark consciousness feeding on the city's entropy, was near, waiting, watching, hungry. The mirrored city was no longer a distant image captured in photographs. It was a living nightmare, one from which escape was uncertain. Yet Elias's resolve hardened. He would confront this darkness or be consumed by it. As the storm raged around him, Elias plunged deeper into the reflected city's heart, the boundary between worlds dissolving with every step. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he stepped fully into the reflected city, the shattered mirror frame dissolving behind him like mist vanishing in sunlight. The world around him was a grotesque simulacrum of the city he knew, a place stretched and twisted like a funhouse reflection, where streets bent at impossible angles and buildings rotted in slow-motion decay. The damp, metallic scent of stagnant water filled the air, thick and heavy, seeping into his lungs with every hesitant breath. Beneath his worn boots, puddles of inky water rippled faintly, though no breeze stirred the stillness. Faint whispers echoed, unintelligible yet laden with sorrow and menace, as if the very atmosphere mourned the city's fate. He moved cautiously, each step measured, camera hanging limply at his side. His eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement. Nothing felt stable. The reflected city was alive, but not in any way he had expected. It was a place suspended between worlds, a liminal space where decay was not merely physical but spiritual, where entropy gnawed at the edges of existence itself. From the corner of his vision, a figure emerged, a pale, gaunt man stepping silently from a broken window, like a ghost materializing from the fractured glass. The reflected man's eyes were hollow, void of pupils, his features warped as if viewed through a cracked lens. He mimicked Elias's movements with a disturbing precision, yet with subtle delays and distortions that made every mirrored gesture feel uncanny and threatening. The silence between them was thick, charged with an unspoken knowledge. Elias's heart pounded painfully against his ribs as he tried to speak, but words caught in his throat. The reflected man's gaze bore into him, unblinking, a silent summons to understand the truth lurking beneath the reflected surface. Though no words were exchanged, Elias felt the weight of centuries of forgotten pain and corruption pressing down upon him. This was no mere shadow or apparition, it was an emissary of the inversion's dark will. Around them, the city seemed to breathe in slow, agonizing gasps. The buildings groaned and leaned precariously, their facades peeling like dead skin. Shadowy figures drifted just beyond his focus, flickering like static on an old television screen. Their forms were indistinct, faces blurred or absent, voices rising in fragmented whispers that spoke of despair, warning, and a hunger that could not be sated. Elias strained to catch their words, but meaning slipped away like water through fingers. The oppressive atmosphere pressed closer, colors draining from the world, until all that remained were muted grays and sickly shades of green. The air pulsed with a malevolent hunger, as if the city itself was alive and feeding off the fear that clung to Elias's skin. He felt his own identity fray at the edges, memories and certainties dissolving in the face of this relentless rot. Yet amid the despair, a flicker of defiance sparked within him. He clenched his fists, focusing on the shards of reality he still grasped. He was here now, caught between worlds, but he would not succumb without a fight. The inversion was a force of decay and inversion, but Elias's artistic vision and determination still burned, fragile yet unyielding. The reflected man stepped closer, his presence both a threat and a guide. Elias realized this encounter was a turning point, a moment to confront the darkness and glimpse the true nature of the reflection's curse. But as the shadows deepened and the city's heartbeats slowed to a hollow drum, he knew the path ahead would test the limits of his sanity and the boundaries of his very existence. With trembling hands, Elias raised his camera, aiming it at the reflected man. The shutter's click echoed unnaturally loud in the stagnant air, capturing not just an image, but a fragment of the inversion's essence. The figure's hollow eyes flickered with something like recognition or perhaps amusement before dissolving into the shifting shadows once more. Elias lowered the camera, swallowing the rising tide of fear. The reflected city awaited, its secrets folding around him like cold water. Somewhere in the depths of this nightmarish inversion lay the heart of the inversion itself, a dark consciousness feeding on entropy and decay, threatening to consume both his world and the one beneath the glass. Steeling himself against the encroaching madness, Elias stepped forward, drawn deeper into the labyrinth of reflections and ruin. The journey was far from over, and the true horror was only beginning. The air in the reflected city was thick with an unbearable weight, pressing down on Elias's chest as he stepped cautiously into the central square, a fragmented mirror of the city he once knew. The buildings around him trembled subtly, their edges quivering like the surface of disturbed water, as if the very fabric of this inverted world was unraveling. Shadows stretched and twisted, peeling away from familiar shapes into grotesque, impossible forms that defied logic and gravity. Elias's breath came shallow, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm in his ears. He gripped his camera tightly, the leather strap a small comfort against the overwhelming alienness that suffused the place. Each step he took was met with the unsettling sensation that the ground beneath him was shifting, the cracked pavement breathing in sync with the slow decay that seemed to eat away at the city's reflected bones. Then, as if summoned from the depths of this nightmare, the reflected man emerged from the periphery of his vision. Silent and spectral, the pale figure moved with a fluid grace, his distorted visage a warped echo of Elias himself. Their eyes locked, Elias's restless, haunted gaze meeting the empty, pupil-less stare of his double. Without a word, the reflected man turned and began to lead, his steps leaving no imprint on the soggy ground, beckoning Elias further into the labyrinthine heart of the inversion's domain. Around them, the ambient noise faded into an eerie silence punctuated only by distant whispers, indistinct voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls, murmuring secrets in a tongue half-remembered. The city's decay was not merely physical. It was as if the reflection itself was alive, a sentient rot that crept into the cracks of Elias's mind, fraying the edges of his sanity. The path twisted and warped beneath his feet, the reflected city folding in on itself. Walls liquefied into shimmering veils, and windows became endless abysses, swallowing the dim light. Then suddenly the air turned frigid, a darkness deeper than night descending like a suffocating shroud. From this shadowed void, the inversion revealed itself not as a form, but as a presence. It was a living entropy, a mass of shifting darkness and fractured reflections that warped the space around Elias. The very reality bent and buckled, colors bleeding into one another, sounds distorting into dreadful cacophonies. It was as if the inversion was the embodiment of decay itself, a metaphysical force that sought to dissolve boundaries and consume all existence. Elias staggered back, his mind reeling as the inversion's influence clawed at his thoughts. Memories twisted, faces blurred, and his sense of self began to fragment. Yet, amidst the chaos, a spark of defiance flared within him. Raising his camera with trembling hands, he steadied his aim at the swirling darkness. The shutter clicked, and a brilliant flash cut through the gloom. For a fleeting instant, the grotesque visage of the inversion was illuminated, a fractured mirror of despair and ruin, a mass of writhing shadows and broken reflections. Then the darkness surged back, swallowing the image and plunging Elias into silence once more. That momentary capture of the entity's form granted Elias a strange clarity, a reminder that this horror, however vast and unfathomable, could be witnessed, confronted, and perhaps resisted. But as the echoes of the flash faded, so too did the fragile barrier between his mind and the inversion's corruptive reach grow thinner. Elias's breath hitched as the reflected man's hollow gaze returned, an unspoken warning lingering in the air. The fight for his reality had only just begun, and the shadows whispered that the inversion's hunger was far from sated. The city beneath its own reflection awaited its fate, and Elias stood at the precipice of a collapse that could erase the boundary between worlds forever. With trembling resolve, he tightened his grip on the camera, steeling himself for the darkness yet to come. The nightmare had revealed its heart, and Elias knew that the true battle was only beginning. The air was thick with a palpable weight, as if the very atmosphere resonated with decay and despair. Elias found himself standing in the heart of the reflected city, a place that defied all laws of physics and sanity. Around him, buildings twisted and writhed in impossible geometries, their surfaces cracked and peeling like ancient skin. Shadows slithered along the edges of broken windows, their movements serpentine and sinister, casting elongated shapes that danced with malicious intent. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale tasting of stagnant water and forgotten memories. The sky above was a roiling, bruised canvas, an eternal twilight smeared with hues of sickly purples and dull grays. The very ground beneath Elias's feet seemed unstable, shifting subtly like the reflection of rippling water, threatening to swallow him whole. Clutching his camera like a talisman, Elias forced his legs forward. Every step echoed with a hollow clang, reverberating oddly, as if the sound itself fractured and refracted through the warped environment. The reflected man materialized without warning, stepping from the shadows with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. His pale, gaunt face was a grotesque mimicry of Elias's own, eyes void of pupils yet brimming with a cold, unyielding intelligence. "You cannot run," the figure whispered, his voice a fragmented echo like glass scraping against glass. "This is your truth, your reflection. Here you belong." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging him onward. Paranoia clawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced himself to focus. The reflected man's presence was a paradox, both guide and tormentor, a twisted mirror of his own obsession. Holding up a fractured shard of mirror he had found earlier, Elias glimpsed fleeting images, shifting corridors, decayed facades. The throbbing pulse of the inversion's presence lurking just beyond perception. The landscape around him convulsed violently as the inversion's influence surged. Walls crumbled into dust, only to reconstitute themselves into grotesque forms. Colors blurred and merged, warping the environment into a kaleidoscope of nightmare. Sounds distorted, whispers became screams, footsteps echoed in impossible rhythms, and the air vibrated with a sinister hum that seemed to seep into Elias's bones. Amidst the chaos, Elias felt the inversion's grasp tighten on his mind, a cold, parasitic force seeking to unravel his very identity. Memories fractured, reality distorted, and the boundaries between self and reflection blurred perilously. Yet, within this maelstrom of entropy, a flicker of clarity remained, a stubborn ember of his artistic vision and determination. Navigating through the labyrinthine cityscape, Elias sought the fractured mirror portal Mara had described in her texts, a threshold shimmering with unstable light, promising escape yet fraught with unknown peril. The reflected man's distorted silhouette flitted at the periphery of his vision, simultaneously beckoning and warning. With every agonizing step, the city seemed to implode and expand, time dilating and contracting like the breath of some colossal, slumbering beast. Elias's hands trembled as he raised the mirror shard, its surface rippling like a disturbed pond. The inversion's presence surged, tendrils of shadow reaching for him, whispering promises of oblivion and reunion with the drowned past. Summoning every ounce of his fading strength, Elias lunged toward the mirror portal. The world shattered in a cacophony of light and shadow, reflections colliding with reality in a violent dance. He felt himself pulled through the fractured surface, a sensation of falling and rising simultaneously, a disorienting plunge into the unknown, and then silence. Elias collapsed onto cold, uneven pavement, gasping for breath. The storm's fury roared in the distance, but here, in the fractured boundary between worlds, a fragile stillness hung in the air. He was back in the flooded city, but forever changed. His mind bore the scars of the inversion's assault, and the reflected city's creeping presence haunted every mirror and glass surface. Yet, amid the lingering dread, a single, stubborn truth remained. He had fought the entropy, escaped the collapse if only for now. The battle was far from over, but Elias was alive. And in the depths of his haunted gaze, the flicker of a new obsession kindled one that might yet unravel or redeem the fragile boundary between worlds. As he rose, clutching his camera, the distant lightning illuminated the waterlogged streets. Reflections shimmered alive, watching, waiting. Elias knew the fight for escape was only the beginning. The inversion's shadow stretched long, and the cycle of decay and awakening would continue. But for this moment, he stood firm, a solitary witness to a nightmare beneath the surface, a photographer caught between worlds, fighting to hold on to the last fragments of his own reality. The sky above the reflected city fractured, like a shattered mirror, splintering the twilight into shards of impossible angles and colors that bled into one another. Elias stood at the threshold of a cracked pane, the surface trembling beneath his fingers, and behind it the drowned city, his reflection's prison, began to break apart with agonizing slowness. The buildings that once loomed with a melancholy grandeur now twisted and folded in on themselves, their decayed facades rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. A cold wind whispered through the shattered streets, carrying with it the faintest echoes of voices distorted, warped, and distant, as if the souls trapped within this inverted world were screaming beneath a veil of silence. Elias's breath came shallow and quick, eyes darting to the warped skyline that flickered between solidity and dissolution. He raised his camera instinctively, but the lens seemed to distort rather than clarify, capturing a kaleidoscope of broken realities rather than a singular truth. Suddenly, the reflected man emerged from the fragmented glass, his pale form blending with the cracks, features melting and reforming like wax dripping over a flame. His eyes, void of pupils, locked onto Elias with an unsettling intensity. "You see it now," the figure whispered, voice like the scraping of rusted metal. "The boundary thins, the inversion wakes." Elias swallowed hard, the words reverberating through his mind. Why is this happening now?" he demanded, voice trembling. "Because the cycle must turn," the reflected man replied, stepping closer as the world around them bent and folded. "Decay feeds on itself, and the mirror will swallow the real." The ground beneath Elias' feet shifted. He stumbled backward as the reflected city convulsed, buildings inverting with impossible geometry, walls becoming ceilings, streets folding upward like paper, windows fracturing into infinite reflections that trapped light and shadow in a perpetual dance of entropy. The air was thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of salt and rot, and the distant cries morphed into a low, haunting chorus that pressed against Elias's mind, threatening to unravel his sanity. He turned to run, but his own reflection in the broken glass rebelled. It jerked and twisted, mimicking him with grotesque exaggerations, a gaping maw where his mouth should have been, eyes flashing malevolent light. For a fleeting moment, the reflection reached out, and Elias felt a coldness seep into his skin as if their identities briefly overlapped. A horrifying exchange of self and image. "No," he gasped, shaking his head, trying to separate his will from the reflections. The world spun, and the boundary between the real city and its inverted twin blurred into a swirling abyss of fractured light and shadow. As the reflected city collapsed further, the shards of reality pierced through the veil, and Elias found himself caught in the terrifying flux, neither fully in his world nor completely consumed by the inversion. He grasped at the remnants of his sanity, heart hammering with the knowledge that if he failed now, he would be lost forever to the endless decay beneath the surface. The shattered boundaries whispered promises of oblivion, but Elias clenched his jaw and stepped forward, camera in hand, determined to capture the final moments of the reflected city's collapse and perhaps, in doing so, find a way back from the brink. In the twilight of two worlds, where reflections fracture and identities invert, Elias's fight was just beginning. The storm had arrived with a fury unlike any Elias had witnessed before, a tempest that seemed to rage not just outside but within the very fabric of his being. The sky churned with roiling black clouds, and the wind howled like a chorus of wailing ghosts, tearing at the torn edges of the reflected city that clung desperately to existence. Lightning fractured the darkened sky, illuminating the warped silhouettes of buildings twisted in impossible angles, their decayed facades dripping with an otherworldly rot. Elias stood at the threshold where reality and reflection twisted into one another, the boundary between worlds thinning like fragile glass about to shatter. Around him the water surged violently, churning with unseen currents that tugged at his legs, threatening to pull him back into the abyss. His breath came in ragged gasps, heart-hammering as the storm's cacophony drowned out even the frantic pounding of his pulse. Behind him, the reflected city groaned and cracked, its ruined streets folding in on themselves like a dying heartbeat. The once vivid, eerie silence was replaced by the sounds of crumbling masonry, the wet slap of falling debris, and the unsettling murmur of shadowed voices rising in a chorus of despair. Elias's camera hung heavy at his side, a silent witness to the horrors he had witnessed, its lens fogged with the spray of rain and tears he dared not shed. Then, from the fractured surface of a mirror shard embedded in the floodwater, the reflected man emerged, his pale, gaunt face distorted by the rippling reflection. His eyes, hollow and devoid of pupils, bore into Elias with a silent, accusatory intensity. The figure moved with a fluid grace, a warped mimicry of Elias's own trembling form, yet every gesture carried a subtle, sinister difference that set Elias's nerves aflame. Elias stumbled backward, struggling to maintain his footing as the boundary itself seemed to convulse. The mirrored world behind the reflected man twisted and folded like a dying star collapsing inward, the decayed architecture crumbling into a dark abyss where no light could penetrate. The inversion's presence was palpable, a choking miasma of entropy and decay, hungry for release. Summoning every ounce of strength and will, Elias lunged forward, breaking through the surface of the mirror just as it cracked wide open beneath him. He fell hard onto the flooded street of his own city, the cold rain lashing his face, mingling with the sweat and grime of his ordeal. His body trembled violently, lungs heaving as he fought to draw in ragged breaths, eyes wide and haunted. The storm still raged around him, but here, in the familiar decay of the flooded city, a fragile tether to reality remained. Yet even as Elias struggled to rise, his gaze was drawn involuntarily to a cracked mirror propped against the wall of a ruined building. In its fractured surface, the reflected city flickered like a dying ember, shadowed streets and restless figures lurking just beyond the veil, watching, waiting. Elias's fingers trembled as he raised his camera, capturing the fleeting glimpse of the other world that refused to fade. His mind reeled with the knowledge that the nightmare was far from over. The boundary between worlds was broken, fragile, and vulnerable to collapse. The inversion's whispered promises of decay and dissolution echoed in his ears like a dirge. As the storm began to wane, Elias remained on his knees, drenched and broken, caught between relief and despair. The reflected city was still there, a persistent shadow beneath the surface of his reality, and he its unwilling witness and chronicler. The scars of his passage through the inversion marked him indelibly a watcher, forever haunted by what lies beneath the mirror's gleam. Darkness settled over the flooded streets, and Elias knew that the cycle of decay and awakening would continue, the reflection's influence rising again with the tide. He was irrevocably changed, bound to the fragile, haunted border between worlds, where reflection and reality bled into one another in an endless, inverted dance. Yet amidst the encroaching dread, a faint ember of resolve flickered in Elias's soul. He would bear witness, document, and perhaps, in time, find a way to confront the inversion once more. For now, however, survival was his only victory, a narrow escape from the abyss, and a return to a world forever altered. The night deepened, the storm's fury spent, but its echoes lingering in the air like a warning. Elias stared into the cracked mirror again, the reflected city's restless gaze meeting his own. And somewhere beneath the surface, the inversion waited, patient and eternal. The town that slept beneath its own reflection did not awaken fully that night. But it stirred, and Elias' marrow, haunted survivor and reluctant chronicler, was its lone sentinel against the coming darkness. The boundary had been shattered, but the story was far from over. Elias sat hunched over his desk, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the scattered photographs pinned to the walls of his cramped apartment. The air was thick with the faint scent of damp paper and stale coffee, a heavy reminder of the nights spent poring over images that refused to release their secrets. He adjusted the focus on his camera, eyes flickering to the cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the far wall. The mirror was always there, a silent sentinel holding the city's twin in its glassy depths. Tonight, as Elias's tired gaze met his own reflection, a subtle movement caught his eye, a distortion, a wavering of the image behind him. He blinked once, twice, but the shadow remained, a pale, gaunt figure standing just beyond his shoulder, its eyes hollow and unblinking. Elias's breath hitched. He spun around, but the room was empty, the mirror reflecting only the peeling wallpaper, and the faint outline of his own gaunt frame. A shiver ran down his spine. The reflected city was no longer confined to the photographs or the occasional glimpse in puddles and windows. It had come home with him, inhabiting every reflective surface with its spectral inhabitants, watching and waiting. He could feel their eyes, those empty pits of darkness, boring into his skin, whispering promises of madness and revelation. The door creaked open softly. Mara stepped inside, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room, taking in the chaotic collage of images that now covered every inch of wall space. She carried a worn leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle, a tangible link to the city's forgotten past. "Elias," she said gently, setting the book down beside him. "You've been at this for days. You need to rest." He shook his head, voice hoarse. "I can't stop now, Mara. The reflection, it's still here. I see them everywhere. In every mirror, every window. They're rewatching." Mara's brow furrowed with concern. "I know. The texts I found, the stories Jonas told me. It's like the city's trauma never truly ended. The reflected city is awake, alive beneath the glass. But you have to remember what's real, Elias. Don't lose yourself to the shadows." Elias nodded absently, his eyes drawn back to the photographs on the screen. Buildings twisted into impossible angles, streets crumbled into black water, figures gliding silently through the decay. The images pulsed faintly, as if breathing beneath the surface, a living archive of the crossing between worlds. Later that night, stepping out into the rain-soaked streets, Elias paused before a storefront window. The reflection shimmered under the street lamp's glow, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the pale, distorted figure, the reflected man standing just behind his mirrored self. The figure's eyes met his, empty yet filled with unspoken warnings. Then, as if dissolving into mist, it vanished, leaving only the cold wind and the distant echo of dripping water. Elias's heart hammered in his chest. The boundary between his world and the reflection was thinner than ever, trembling on the edge of collapse. The photographs he had taken, the images he had captured in desperate hope, were now his only defense and his curse. They preserved the memory of what lay beneath the surface, but also tethered him to a nightmare that would not release its hold. Back in the apartment, Mara watched him carefully, her presence a fragile tether to reality. Yet even she could not deny the change that had come over Elias, the haunted look in his eyes, the restless energy that drove him toward the mirrors and the camera's lens. The reflected city was no longer just a spectral place trapped beneath the surface of water and glass. It was a living presence, bleeding into their world, and Elias was caught in the tide. "We have to find a way to stop this," Mara said softly, "or at least to contain it, before it consumes everything." Elias met her gaze, the weight of their shared dread hanging heavy between them. "I don't know if stopping it is possible," he whispered. "But I will keep watching. I will keep documenting. Because if the reflection rises again, we need to be ready." As the first light of dawn filtered through the cracked window, the photographs on the wall shimmered faintly once more. The reflected city watched, waited and breathed beneath its own glassy veil. And Elias, forever its witness, remained trapped between worlds, a guardian of fragile boundaries and haunted reflections. The night was far from over, and the cycle of decay and awakening was not yet complete. The rain drummed steadily against the leaded glass windows of the old library, the sound a steady pulse that seemed to echo the relentless beat of Mara's own heart. She sat at a battered oak table in the back room, the air thick with the musky scent of aging paper and dust. Around her, stacks of books towered precariously, ancient tomes whose cracked spines and yellowed pages whispered of forgotten histories and long-buried secrets. Across from her, Elias Marrow sat hunched, his restless eyes flicking between the pages Mara read aloud and the dim light of the flickering lamp overhead. And so the city beneath the glass sleeps not as death, but as a breath held, waiting for the moment of release, Mara intoned, her voice low and steady despite the chill crawling along her spine. She closed the book gently, the words lingering in the dim room like a faint echo. This passage. It talks about the reflection not as a mere image, but as a living, waiting thing. Elias nodded slowly, his gaunt face drawn tight with exhaustion and something deeper and almost reverent fear. "It's what I've been trying to tell you," he whispered, fingers trembling as he adjusted the worn strap of his camera. "It's not just a trick of light or water, it's alive. It's waking up." Mara's eyes searched his face, seeing the obsession etched there as clearly as the pale scars on his hands. She'd tried to pull him back from the edge, to ground him in the tangible world of facts and reason. But the reflected city clung to him like a shadow, growing stronger with each passing day. "Elias," she said softly, "I'm scared, but I can't just watch you slip away. If this thing, the reflection, is real, then maybe the only way to fight it is to understand it together." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Elias's lips curled into a wary, grateful smile. "I don't want to lose you," he confessed, voice breaking. "I need you with me." Their alliance forged in the flickering lamplight, Mara found herself drawn deeper into the unsettling world Elias inhabited. At his apartment, mirrors lined the walls like silent sentinels, their surfaces shimmering with faint, shifting images that defied explanation. Elias moved from mirror to mirror, snapping photograph after photograph, his eyes wide and unblinking as the reflected city revealed itself in fleeting glimpses. Mara stood at the edge of the room, heart pounding as she watched the impossible scenes unfold, decayed buildings twisted in impossible angles, shadowy figures moving with unnatural grace. "I wish I could see what you see," Mara murmured, voice barely audible. Elias glanced at her, a flicker of something like hope passing through his haunted gaze. "Maybe one day you will, but for now your eyes and your mind are the anchors I need." The tension between them was palpable, a fragile thread stretched taut between dread and reluctant fascination. Mara's skepticism battled with the undeniable reality of Elias's experiences, and though fear gripped her tightly, she resolved not to abandon him. Days later, under a slate-gray sky heavy with unshed rain, Mara confronted Elias in the flooded streets. Water lapped at their boots as they navigated the half-submerged ruins of their city, the reflections around them warping and twisting like living things. Mara's voice trembled as she spoke, frustration and worry mingling in her words. "You can't keep going like this, Elias. The obsession, it's eating you alive." Elias met her gaze, the restless light in his eyes undimmed. "I'm already gone, Mara. But if I don't do this, if I don't understand the reflection, then what am I?" Silence stretched between them, the weight of their shared dread pressing down like the dark clouds above. Then Mara reached out, her hand steady on his arm. "We'll face it together, whatever it is." That night, alone once more in the quiet sanctuary of the library, Mara pored over a cryptic manuscript she had discovered tucked away in a forgotten corner. Candlelight flickered against the fragile pages as her fingers traced the faded script, circling a passage that spoke of cycles of awakening and decay, of the persistent echo of trauma etched into the very fabric of the city. Her breath caught. The reflection was no mere hallucination or trick of light. It was a force, ancient and relentless, entwined with the city's history of loss and sorrow. Mara closed the book slowly, a shiver running through her. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of the story now, caught in the fragile boundary where reality and reflection collided, her resolve hardening like the stones beneath the water. As dawn crept over the flooded streets, Mara knew their lives had changed irrevocably. The reflected city waited beneath the glass, restless and awakening, and she and Elias were its unwilling witnesses and perhaps its last hope. But in the depths of her mind, a question lingered, dark and unyielding. Could their fragile alliance withstand the growing horror, or would the reflection consume them both, erasing the boundary between worlds forever? And with that uncertain thought, the city waited silent, decayed, and watching through the looking glass. The persistence of decay was no longer a distant whisper, but a suffocating presence that threaded through Elias' waking hours and haunted his dreams. Each morning, the cracked mirror over his dresser greeted him with a distorted cityscape, its ruins undulating behind his pale, tired eyes. The reflection was no longer static. It breathed, shivered, and shifted with a life of its own. The warped skyline seemed to pulse, as if the drowned city beneath the glass was awakening, its rot seeping into his fragile reality. Elias approached the mirror cautiously, camera slung around his neck, fingers trembling. He lifted the lens and focused, but the image was maddeningly unstable. Buildings crumbled and reformed, shadows lengthened and recoiled like living things. A faint, salt-tinged mist seemed to rise from the glass, brushing against his skin like the breath of drowned ghosts. He blinked hard, willing himself to stay grounded, yet the line between reflection and reality blurred further with each passing second. Outside, the rain whispered against the window panes, a relentless rhythm that echoed the slow decay within Elias' mind. The city beyond his apartment was flooded and silent, yet the reflected twin pulsed with unsettling vitality. He felt its gaze, an oppressive, hollow weight pressing through the layers of glass and water, watching, waiting. Mara's footsteps were swift and deliberate when she arrived that afternoon, her face drawn with worry beneath the harsh library lights. She found Elias hunched over his photographs, eyes glassy and unfocused, tracing the twisted contours of the reflected city with a pale finger. "Elias," she said softly, yet her voice carried the sharp edge of urgency. "You can't keep doing this. It's pulling you under." He looked up, a flicker of recognition and something darker passing through his restless eyes. "I have to understand, Mara. It's not just a reflection. It's a city alive, decaying, awakening. If I don't document it, who will?" She shook her head, the weight of helplessness pressing down. "But at what cost? You're losing yourself. The line between what's real and what's mirrored is disappearing for you." Her words echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind, yet the obsession only tightened its grip. He wanted to believe the photographs would hold the truth, a fragile tether to reality. Instead, they became gateways, windows into the corruption that spread like a stain. Later that evening, the city's whispered decay followed him into a rain-soaked alley. The harsh neon signs flickered, casting fractured light on puddles that mirrored the world above and below. There, in a broken shop window, the silhouette of the reflected man appeared, pale and gaunt, eyes void of pupils yet piercing through the gloom. Elias froze, heart pounding, as the figure mimicked his stance with eerie precision. The reflection's lips curled into a silent, accusing smile, a reminder of the inversion's unyielding presence. The chill that seeped from the glass seemed to seep into his bones. He raised his camera, fingers shaking violently, trying to capture the apparition. The shutter clicked, but the image shattered into grotesque mosaics of shadow and light, the reflection fracturing into a nightmarish collage. The reflected man's form dissolved into the darkness, leaving only an echo of dread. Back in his apartment, Elias sifted through the photographs, each frame a tapestry of decay and distortion. The reflected city's ruins bled into his vision, a relentless reminder of the fragile boundary he struggled to maintain. Mara's voice haunted him in his solitude, her warnings a fragile lifeline against the encroaching madness. Yet the reflection's pull was a relentless tide, eroding his grip on identity and reality. As the night deepened, Elias stood before the mirror once more. The glass rippled, the city beneath shifting with grotesque grace. He reached out a trembling hand, fingertips brushing the cold surface, and felt the boundary thin to a fragile membrane. The reflection whispered promises of revelation and oblivion, decay and rebirth. Elias's breath caught as a dark certainty settled within him. The inversion's influence was no fleeting shadow, but an eternal cycle of awakening and decay. And he was now irrevocably entwined within its grasp. The question lingered in the silence: how far could he resist before the reflection consumed all that he was? And as the city slept beneath its own broken mirror, the cycle continued, relentless and unforgiving. Elias sat motionless in the dimness of his apartment, the only light a flickering candle struggling against the heavy shadows. Around him, the walls were covered with his photographs, dozens upon dozens of images capturing the flooded city and its mysterious reflections. Each picture was a fragment of a puzzle he could never fully solve, a piece of a world that seemed at once distant and intimately close. The distorted faces and warped architecture in the photographs pulsed faintly in his mind, as if breathing with a slow, measured rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of the reflected city beneath the surface. He traced the edges of one particularly haunting image, where a ghostly figure lingered just beneath the water's glassy veneer. The face was indistinct, blurred by the ripples that constantly danced across the surface, but its eyes seemed to bore into him with a silent message, one of warning, of inevitability. A cold shiver ran down Elias's spine as the weight of the city's past trauma settled over him, pressing like a physical force. The door creaked softly, and Mara stepped inside, clutching a worn leather-bound book. The musty scent of ancient paper filled the space between them, mingling with the dampness that always seemed to cling to Elias's apartment. She moved quietly, placing the book on the cluttered table, her sharp eyes scanning the photographs pinned everywhere. "I found more," she said softly, opening the book to reveal pages filled with archaic symbols and faded script. More about the city's past, about the inversion. It's not just a one-time event. It's a cycle, the decay, the awakening. It repeats. Elias looked up, his gaunt face etched with exhaustion and fear. A cycle. He echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. So this reflected city, it's trapped in an endless loop. Mara nodded solemnly. The texts suggest that the city's collective trauma, the floods, the losses, the forgotten histories, have woven a kind of curse. Every time the boundary weakens, the inversion stirs. It reaches out, trying to merge the reflected world with ours, spreading its decay. And then it retreats, only to gather strength again. The truth settled heavily between them. Elias felt as though the walls were closing in, the candlelight flickering as if struggling against the oppressive quiet. He thought of the countless nights spent watching reflections, chasing shadows that slipped just beyond understanding. The faces in the water, the distorted architecture, the eerie movements in mirrors, they were all part of a relentless, unseen cycle that no one could escape. "What do we do?" Elias asked, the desperation creeping into his voice. "Can we stop it?" Mara's eyes held a mix of hope and sorrow. "I don't know. But we can document it. We can bear witness. Maybe that's all that's left, to remember, so the city isn't forgotten again." Elias nodded slowly, the resolve hardening inside him even as dread gnawed at his thoughts. He rose and moved toward the mirror hanging by the window. Rain streaked down the glass, blurring his reflection. For a moment, the surface shimmered unnaturally. Within the wavering image, faint shapes moved, ghostly echoes of the inversion's presence. The pale, gaunt face of the reflected man flickered at the edge of his vision before vanishing. He swallowed hard and whispered, "It's still there. Always watching." Outside, night enveloped the flooded city. The water's surface lay calm and black, reflecting the distant glow of broken streetlights and the hollow silhouettes of drowned buildings. But beneath the stillness, subtle ripples stirred an unseen pulse that seemed to breathe beneath the glassy skin of the world. Time itself felt as if it were folding back upon itself, dragging the city deeper into the cycle of decay and awakening. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The inversion's return was inevitable. He was no longer merely an observer, but a reluctant witness to a fate much larger than himself. The photographs he took, the stories he shared with Mara, they were his only weapons against the creeping darkness. As he turned away from the mirror, the candle guttered, casting fleeting shadows that twisted and swirled like living things. He knew that tomorrow and the days after would bring more questions, more encounters with the reflection's restless inhabitants. The cycle would continue, relentless and unseen. But for now, Elias held fast to the fragile thread of his own reality, clinging to the hope that by watching, by remembering, he might delay the inevitable, or at least bear witness, when the cycle turned anew. And somewhere just beneath the surface, the reflected city waited, sleeping beneath its own reflection, ready to awaken once more. The night stretched on, thick with the scent of rain and decay, as Elias sat back down, camera in hand. The endless cycle of reflection and inversion had become his life's burden, a haunting melody that echoed through the flooded streets and shattered mirrors alike. Yet in that haunting there was purpose: to watch, to document, to remember. The town that slept beneath its own reflection would never truly rest, and neither would he. The air in Elias's apartment was heavy with the scent of damp paper and chemical fixatives. A faint echo of the flooded streets outside that now seemed less like a setting and more like a lingering wound. He stood before the cracked mirror, mounted crookedly on the peeling wall, his breath fogging the glass as his eyes searched the rippling surface. Beneath the sheen, the reflected city stirred, a ghostly twin world suspended in water and shadow, its decayed facades shimmering with unnatural light. Elias's fingers trembled as he reached out, but the glass was cold and unmoving, a barrier and a veil. Days, or perhaps weeks, had passed in this liminal state of watching and waiting. Time had lost its meaning, warped like the reflections he so obsessively captured. Each photograph he developed in the cramped, red-lit darkroom revealed more than mere images. They were grim testimonies of the crossing, frozen moments of entropy and inversion. Buildings crumbled in impossible angles, faces without features emerged from watery depths, and shadows moved with an intelligence that defied explanation. The silence around him was oppressive, punctuated only by the gentle drip of water leaking through the walls, a rhythmic reminder of the city's slow decay. Mara's cautious footsteps echoed down the hallway one evening, her presence a fragile tether to the world Elias was slipping from. She carried a bundle of ancient texts, dog-eared pages filled with cryptic warnings and fragmented histories. Her sharp eyes softened as she entered the dim room, her voice a low murmur against the oppressive quiet. Elias, we found more references to the reflection cycle. It's not just a haunting, it's a force that persists, feeding on the city's trauma and grief. We can't ignore it anymore. Elias nodded, the exhaustion etched into his gaunt features. I know. I see it every time I look into a mirror or a puddle. It waits, it watches. And it's not content to stay beneath the surface. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden chill, the air thickening with an intangible presence. Elias turned toward the rain-soaked window, where the silhouette of the reflected man emerged, a pale, distorted figure whose pupil-less eyes bore into Elias with a silent, unsettling acknowledgement. The boundary between worlds felt thinner than ever, the haunting promise of the reflections' return lingering in the shadows. In the days that followed, Elias and Mara worked together to archive the photographs, each print a portal into the decayed inversion. Despite the growing danger, Mara's resolve strengthened, her pragmatism a counterbalance to Elias's obsession. Yet the toll on Elias was evident. His restless eyes darted to every reflective surface, his conversations occasionally punctuated by whispered dialogues with unseen presences. The cycle of decay and awakening was not merely a story etched in water and glass, it was a living nightmare that Elias now embodied. As night fell over the flooded city, Elias stood once more before the cracked mirror. The reflected city pulsed faintly beneath the surface, its ghostly inhabitants restless and watching. He raised his camera, framing the impossible scene not as a mere photographer, but as a guardian of the fragile boundary. The shutter clicked, echoing like a heartbeat in the silence, capturing not just an image, but a testament to the enduring horror and melancholic beauty of the town that slept beneath its own reflection. And as the photograph developed, revealing the distorted, decayed visage of the inverted city, Elias knew the cycle would continue. The reflection's influence was a persistent force, woven into the fabric of the city's soul, and his own fractured mind. Somewhere beyond the glass, the inversion waited, patient and eternal, ready to rise again. The night deepened, the water outside lapping relentlessly against forgotten streets. Elias's eyes met his own reflected gaze, an image both familiar and strange. Between worlds, between realities, he stood watch. The town beneath its own reflection was not gone. It was merely sleeping, waiting for the next awakening. And Elias Marrow, haunted survivor and reluctant witness, would be there to see it unfold once more.